Welcome to Trades Take 10. Today we have a special guest. He's located here in Calgary. Please, Frank McShane, thank you for showing up for our show today.
Thank you.
Can you give me just a little bit, how did you get here? What do you do? And give us a starting point.
Sure. And this might sound a lot because I'm only actually 24, but I started working offshore in the oil and gas industry many years ago. And when I was much younger and had a child and decided that the offshore work was not conducive to family life because often was getting sent away at 6 weeks at a time. So I went back to college. I did a master's in environment and environmental studies. It's so long ago I can't actually remember the title of the master's, but it was looking at deforestation, and I did my master's thesis in Belize. Came back and I then got offered a job teaching at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. So I taught there for 2.5 years. And through that, I got offered a place, because I grew up in London, from Ireland originally, but grew up in London in the UK. While I was in Fiji teaching, I was recommended to go to McGill here in Canada, in Montreal, and I did my PhD thesis at McGill. And then from there, I went back into teaching for a brief period of time, but eventually left teaching. I went to London. I was working at the IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development in London, which is an advisory body that advises governments over Europe and all over the place. And then from IIED, I came to Canada. I've been here for 24 years. I came to Calgary following Montreal. And then I got a job with a company called Golder Associates. I worked with them in an advisory capacity doing environmental and social impact assessments. And then from there, I came back into the oil and gas industry, but in a different role. So I worked as a sustainability kind of specialist in oil and gas.
Well, thank you for coming. I should say Dr. Dr. Frank McShane. Listen, a sustainable, what does that mean? What does that mean to you guys? Explain that if you can.
Good question. Sustainability is really, the original definition by the Brundtland Commission many years ago, I can't remember which year precisely, it was back in the 70s, I believe, was preserving the natural resources of today, using them in a way, and I'm paraphrasing here, that is efficient, leaves some for the future, and doesn't damage the environment. Okay. So sustainability nowadays, the context has shifted more to a discussion about risk, and we look at environmental risk, social risk, and governance risk. And those three things together comprise another measure of a company's success or failure, because traditionally people have always looked at financial measures to determine whether a company
That's the bottom line. That's what we want most often.
The bottom line. But now you still have your bottom line, but it has to be tempered with these things that consider the environment, consider social. For example, Indigenous relations would be an aspect of that. Yeah. Consider the governance of the company. Is it strong? Is there strong governance? Is the company behaving in a good, open, transparent way? Ultimately, businesses have got to be economically, financially successful, firstly, to help pay for all the other stuff. But now there's these extra dimensions to success, which include the environment, social, and governance.
And so your company is consulting with other companies to come together for these three main things?
Yeah, we get asked to act in an advisory capacity to companies, and we have certain things, certain sort of tools that we use, but act in an advisory capacity to companies to help them navigate what this sustainability looks like in the context of business.
Okay. I mean, okay, for a smaller oil and gas company, out in the field doing work, maybe they're running a refinery. What kind of sustainability that they can do in that? How does that look in the real world? Like, that's what I'm looking for. Some real
That's a great question.
hard.
So if I were to look at, let's take the example you've used, an oil refinery. So on the environmental side, you'd be looking at, and without going into too much detail on anything, you'd be looking at a host of things. What are your emissions like? How do you manage your waste? Where do you're not dumping it on the land somewhere, you're actually handling it in a responsible way. Your emissions, are you doing your best to cut down on CO2 and other volatile compounds, those kinds of things. And then how are you managing land use around your facility? So that would be the environmental dimension. The social dimension is how are you interacting with the communities around your facility? So you've got this facility. If it's a refinery, it's probably fairly large. It's probably lots of emissions. What are you doing to temper the impact of those potential impact of those emissions on local communities? How are you interacting with various people that have an interest, stakeholders that have an interest in the area? So that would be, I guess a very high level summation of the social aspect. And then the governance aspect is, are you managing all this stuff with, through good governance? Do you have good reporting processes? Do you have a good accountability process throughout the organization? How are you interacting with those communities around the facility? How are you treating your employees? That's all the governance part of it.
Yeah. I would say in this country we have probably the most ethical oil around. I mean, that's a personal opinion.
I'd agree.
In this tumultuous environment that we see ourselves in as of today, what do you see the future holding for what you just said, about this sustainability and social and governance?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, the standards that have been set in these areas, some would say they're currently under attack, or
Yes.
we're receding away from a lot of the sort of benchmarks that have been set, because the focus, particularly south of the border, is very much on business, and not so much on those other the financial aspects of the business, not so much on those other non-financial aspects, which here in Canada we've adopted approaches which really factor those things in. I mean, there's very strong governance around the oil and gas industry.
Yes.
In Canada,
Yes.
in comparison to other jurisdictions, using oil and gas as an example. What is the future? Governments have a great influence, obviously, on the way that companies manage things.
Indeed.
But investors have, for the most part, outside of actual regulation, have a bigger influence. And a lot of the things that happen in that sort of sustainability arena, and the way that companies act and the way that they're governed today, it's actually driven by investors. So even if you see governments kind of walking back, a lot of the investors, like impact investors, for example, they still demand, that companies report on these environmental, social, and governance aspects. And, that language about, they call it ESG, that language is actually, people are shying away from using that terminology now, and it's becoming more about risk management, compliance, and risk mitigation broadly. So how do I see the future of, I mean, I could take your question two ways. How do I see the future of sustainability and all of that sort of governance stuff?
Uh-huh.
I think it will get stronger because in times of risk, and these are certainly, particularly with what's just happened, this is a risky time for Canadian business. And one of the ways that you assure investors is that you pay strong attention to these sort of measures, like what are you doing environmentally? What are you doing? It speaks to good governance of the company, and investors like that. So
I would love to see investment portfolios come up with that kind of heading, because that's the company I want to invest in, that has these, as you say, ESG all set in, and that's front and foremost. And then let me choose who I want to invest with.
yeah, and I think this is another aspect. I mean, that's a good point. And I think this is another aspect of risk management.
Yes, yes, indeed.
And the spectrum of what's included in risk as a risk today has grown. And companies that are well governed are mindful of their reputation, and it doesn't take much to damage your reputation. And we've had some instances here in Calgary in the past where companies have got the wrong side of investors for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And, they've become textbook cases of divesting. People.
You're not wrong. We've all seen that come and go.
Yeah.
If they're in different countries doing different things and not having this ESG foremost in their minds.
Yeah, and I must say, that phrase ESG, that's kind of, the company that I work with, you're seeing that people move away from that terminology precisely because of what's happening politically, that it's becoming less tenable in some states, particularly in the US, to
Yes.
use that ESG terminology. However, if you look at it through a risk management lens, nobody wants to be on the wrong end of an environmental incident or a human rights incident or any of those kinds of things. And so what it's really about is good governance. And it doesn't matter what term you use. People have become very sensitive about the ESG terminology.
Yeah, there's all kinds of new terminology that's getting pushed aside, if we will, today, all around those things.
Yeah.
I appreciate your insight to the oil and gas industry. How about supply chain? How is that using that formula, good governance, sustainability, and social aspects?
So that's another great question. So I could use one example there. A lot of there are various standards that companies have to report to. In Europe, and I'll come back, I'm going a long way around to answer your question. I'll come back to it. In Europe, they have now a mandatory reporting standard where you have to report on your greenhouse gas emissions, and they come in three forms: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 are things you do directly. Scope 2 are sort of the sort of supplementary things that come as a result of the sort of business that you're in, maybe your transport emissions, that kind of thing. And then your Scope 3 is your supply chain emissions, fundamentally. So supply chains have come very much to the forefront of thinking around greenhouse gas management. And that's led to a lot of other scrutiny of how supply chains, suppliers, and client companies work together to manage these environmental and social issues. And there's been some very innovative things in supply chains. So if we look at Scope 3, you can't manage Scope 3 emissions without collaboration between the client company and the supply chain and the suppliers. Another area where supply chains are very much at the forefront currently is with the Canada Modern Slavery Act, call it the Canada Supply Chains Act,
Okay.
which mandates that companies above a certain size in terms of revenue or staff, etc. It mandates that they must report on their efforts to manage the risk of modern slavery, forced child labor in their supply chain.
Wow, that's big, yeah.
Now, we don't see a lot of that actually in Canada. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It exists everywhere. I mean, you do have forms of modern slavery even in Canada.
Yes.
But if you're sourcing your minerals for whatever processes you're pursuing here in Canada, industrial processes, but you're sourcing them from, say, other parts of the world without singling out particular countries, there's perhaps a strong chance that forced and child labour could be involved in that. So there's a piece of legislation that says, you have to take measures to manage this. And actually the regulation just says you have to disclose what you do. It doesn't really force you to do anything in terms of management, but they think that will change. So fundamentally this involves the need for collaboration between the client company and the supply chain and the suppliers, and tracking down the supply chain, tier 1 suppliers, tier 2, to ensure that certain measures are in place. Have you got policies in place? Have you got processes whereby if you suspect that there might be child or slave labor in your supply chain, you've got a supplier at tier 4 level or something that's using children, say somewhere else in the world. How can you monitor that? And the purpose of the legislation is not to hold every Canadian company that has a supply chain overseas responsible for child and slave labor. It's an effort to track it to the extent possible and help, and then take measures to eradicate it. So there are two examples, Scope 3 and modern slavery, where supply chain is extremely important. And, it requires different ways of working with suppliers and client companies.
Wow, that's a pretty good answer. Thank you for that. Your company, Frank. Let's put a plug in for your company here.
Yeah, we're called Shift Critical International. So
Shift Critical International.
Yeah, critical shift,
Okay, yeah.
I mean, we messed around with this. I can't remember. I know we messed around with trying to find a name for it 3 years ago for weeks and weeks, and for some reason we came up with Shift Critical anyway. Mm-hmm. Shift Critical International, and we we're I guess the phrase that I've heard used is boutique, but we're a Calgary-based small company. It's myself and my business partner, Craig Stenhouse. I'll put in a plug for Craig in. And Craig and I worked together many, many years ago, and we'd always talked about starting a business. And seeing as we both worked in the sort of sustainability arena broadly and done lots of different things on the environmental side, the social side, the governance side, we decided to start a company about 3 years ago. We work a lot with oil and gas clients, but we also work with others. We've worked with a variety of companies in different industries, and we offer advice on how can you use sustainability as a strategic advantage. So we do a bunch of different things, everything from emissions management through to modern slavery.
Well, Frank, thank you so much for coming out today. Everybody, Dr. Frank McShane from Shift Critical International. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Welcome to another Math Minute with Doug. See the logo? See the hat? You want your logo here? Your hat here? Send it in to us, and I'll wear it next time we do a Math Minute. Today, we're doing rolling offsets. Let's go. Rolling offsets. This is how we solve for an unknown with rolling offsets. We actually use Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We use a version of that to solve for any rolling offset. Now, just to give us a little bit of a basis, we have a little triangle terminology where we call this the run, this line right here to here. We call this the rise, and this is always the travel. And that's the terminology we use in the pipe trades. So, having said that, we have two formulas that we use for rolling offsets. The first formula is for 45-degree rolling offsets. Here's the formula here. We take the roll and we square it, and we add the rise and we square it, and then we square root that, and that would equal the offset. We simply have to then multiply by 1.414, and that will be our travel. The second formula is for non-45. So everything else, we'll use this formula, and that would be the roll squared plus the rise squared plus the run squared, and we square root that whole thing. That equals the travel. So keep those two formulas in mind as we continue with our rolling offsets. A little more terminology, and here we have, this is the run, this is the roll, this is the complete travel across, and this is the rise. One more thing is this measurement across this diagonal box would be called the offset. This is a little more terminology for a rolling offset. Now let's solve. I'm going to tell you that this is a 45-degree rolling offset. So these are two 45s in each corner. I have been given the rise and I have been given the roll in this one. So our formula from the previous sheet is rise squared plus roll squared square root equals the offset times 1.414 would equal the travel. So let's put our numbers in. 8 squared plus 6 squared square root. So that is 8 squared plus 6 squared equals shift square root. That equals 10. Now we multiply by 1.414. Remember, this is just the offset. We multiply it by 1.414. That would equal the travel of 14.14 is the travel. Let's solve for a non-45-degree rolling offset. Here we have a 51-degree for both of these angles. So the formula that we had for a rolling offset non-45 is the rise squared plus the roll squared. Well, I don't have to put squared up there. And now the run squared. And that would equal the travel. So let's do that. 11 squared plus 10 squared plus 12 squared equals, remember we have to square root that. Let's punch it in the calculator. That's 11 squared plus 10 squared plus 12 squared. Shift square root equals, let's do that again. 11 squared plus 10 squared plus 12 squared equals shift square root. My travel is 19.10, round it up to 5. That's how to solve for a non-45-degree rolling offset. Now, this is a problem that you would find on a print, and we have a plan view, which is a top view. And you can see if this is the top view, then this measurement from this side right to there, right across this, as you can see, is 1,500. So 1,500 here is my roll. The roll is equal to 1,500 millimeters. And now I have an elevation view where I can find the rise of my pipe. So we have 1,500 to the wall minus 750, so 1,500 minus 750. And again, we have to add the 150 to that, so plus 150. That comes up to 900 is my rise. So now if I want to solve for the travel, I simply take my rise squared plus my roll squared square root. That's going to equal the offset. Let me do that on the calculator. That's 900 squared plus 1,500 squared equals shift square root. So my offset is equal to 1749.28 times 1.414 and 2473 we'll call it a 5 is equal to the travel.